Hey, it's Silver, and this is Rusted Moss. Rusted Moss is a 2D Metroidvania that's doing several things quite differently from its peers, you could say. For one, this is probably the first and only Metroidvania that I can personally think of at the moment that actually recommends that you play with a keyboard and mouse instead of a controller. That's very unusual for the genre, but this has full 360-degree aiming because you actually use entirely ranged weapons, guns actually, in this game, and also you have a grappling hook. And the grappling hook is physics-based. It is sort of springy, it's elastic, so it actually bounds you all around the screen, and a large portion of the platforming in this game is all physics-based platforming based entirely around clever usage of this grappling hook. And it is a very open-ended sort of game as a result, because, you know, oftentimes one of the biggest things about a Metroidvania is the movement. You have different sort of tiers of movement that you unlock as you go through the game, and that's what gets you to new areas, like a double jump or a wall jump or a slide dash or something like that. But starting out with a grappling hook means that a large portion of this game is sort of open to you from the start. Now, there is still ability gating, there is still areas that you can only get to after you obtain certain weapons or certain skills, but you do have a lot of the overall map available to you at once, simply because you can kind of just go wherever your grappling hook will take you. The art style of the game is really quite nice looking. I appreciate the sort of, well, it's chunky, but it's also very detailed. It's got that sort of bleak, beautiful world that something like Shadow of the Colossus has. The kind of world where interesting things have happened in the past, and you're just kind of seeing the tail end of this sort of destructive symphony that has made the world what it is, and you aren't really fully aware of what all these ruins are and who once did what here, but you know that you can kind of venture through all of it and explore it for yourself. That means this game has a really solid sense of exploration, which is one of the things I personally always look for as top priority in a Metroidvania. I want the exploration to be interesting, I want it to be fun, and I want it to be rewarding. And this game has a lot to reward you with when it comes to exploration as well, and you'll find there's quite a bit of optional content in this game, in the form especially of like optional bosses and optional platforming challenges that get you to all sorts of fancy things they don't need to beat the game, but that do help. And since the exploration is very heavily focused on this physics-based platforming, you have a lot of time to actually get used to it. The game is effectively a playground for this grappling hook, where everything is set up in such a way to allow you to understand how to use it in different ways, and applying different sorts of physics to it in order to get to different areas. And at first you'll just be, swinging, just a simple from platform to platform swing in a straight line, but soon you'll be learning to do things like making sure to deploy it at certain heights in the air so that it springs you back up and gets you to a higher platform than you can normally reach, or using it to actually go backwards and sort of extend your jump a step ahead by springing yourself in the opposite direction, and some other more advanced techniques like that. It means that the game's movement is very fluid and very enjoyable because you're constantly jetting all around the screen using this grappling hook, and as you go through the game it will get some other powers and things as well, some more stuff that it can do aside from the standard grapple. And you'll also get some other movement capabilities, like for instance a chargeable high jump that you can only use if you're standing on grass, but does open up all sorts of new possibilities to you once you get it. Now, I mentioned the combat is entirely ranged in this game, which is unusual for a Metroidvania, and yes, it is. All of your weapons are guns. You start off with the rail, which is basically an assault rifle that has a semi-automatic fire, basically as fast as you can click the button, or you can hold the mouse button down to charge it, and then it will release a burst of like 5 or so rounds in really quick succession that does a lot of damage. As you explore through the world, you will find other weapons to equip, and you can have all of them at once. By the way, there are 8 different ranged weapons to actually use, so kind of like an old school shooter style of arsenal, and you can just hold a button down to get a weapon wheel and switch to any of them you want for any situation, so you don't have to worry about bringing specific ones along or anything like that. You've always got them all once you find them. And you'll notice something about the weapons in this game, and that they all kind of have something odd about them. They have some sort of odd function or unexpected thing they can do that makes them kind of unique. For instance, early on you'll find a pistol. The pistol is pretty useful because it's very accurate. It's relatively short-ranged, but it fires quickly, and as long as you hold down the button, it will keep firing. But as long as you hold down the button, eventually it will actually start to fire like an SMG. It'll get a bit of a range boost and fire a less accurate spread of very high-speed shots that just kind of shred everything in front of you. And then as soon as you let go of the button, after it started rapid firing like this, it'll shoot out a big saw blade instead as its final sort of shot. And the saw blade will go a fair distance forward and then hover in the air and actually stay there spinning for a while, doing damage over time to anything that touches it. And you can also find some other more powerful stuff too, like for instance the sniper rifle, which is really fun to use. The sniper rifle, as you would expect, fires very slowly, but has a laser sight and shoots in a perfectly accurate straight line every time, and it's chargeable. Most weapons have effectively infinite ammo, but the sniper rifle and some others use your MP gauge to fire instead. However, once you charge a fully charged sniper shot, it's extremely powerful and can actually one-shot like almost all of the normal enemies in the game. Basically, it's really strong, but it does use a lot of your MP up to keep using it. So this is a pretty cool idea. I like the fact that it's like an all-firearms arsenal, just because that's really unusual for a Metroidvania, but it pulls it off really well, partially because the aiming is full 360 degrees with your mouse, so the aiming is very smooth, and also the animation work as well as the sound work for all the weapons and stuff is really nice, and it makes them quite fun to use. Even some relatively simple stuff like the pistol has some nice kind of metallic clanky sound assets to it that add something to the idea that you're using a kind of old pistol that you found somewhere that does some really weird stuff. It gives the arsenal a lot of character in this game, and it means that you have quite a lot of combat variety as well, because 8 weapons in a Metroidvania is a lot of weapons, and the fact that they each have completely different usages and all these different characteristics unto themselves means that you have a very fully featured arsenal before long. I did mention MP, and yes, you are a changeling, so you have an MP gauge, access to some magic. The main thing you start with is a heal. Just tap the E key. As long as you have enough MP, you will stand still for a second, and then a burst of healing will apply to you pretty much right on the spot. So it's a very fast heal that is usable in combat as long as you can find just a second or two free from the wall of bullets to actually be safe somewhere standing still for a minute. Kind of like a Hollow Knight heal, basically. The heal will use your entire MP gauge at first, but one of the various collectible things you can find around the areas while exploring are these batteries that will actually increase your maximum MP. This allows you to store more than just one heal, and actually you can eventually store multiple heals if you find a lot of them. Like I mentioned, some weapons do use the MP as well, and also you'll eventually gain the ability to throw grenades. They're actually like stick grenades, funnily enough, and you need these for getting into certain areas that are blocked off by walls that can only be destroyed with grenades, and there's also several enemies that are better dealt with grenades, even if you can technically kill them with guns normally, but it's a lot easier to just toss a grenade in their direction and blow them up. These do use a fair chunk of your MP though, so you can't exactly spam them. You mostly gain MP just by doing damage. As long as you hit enemies with weapons, you will generate MP for every hit you do. This is one reason to use sometimes very rapid fire weaker weapons, because more fast hits equals more MP. It's not about the damage you deal, it's about how many times you're hitting things. So something that does a ton of damage in one shot is going to generate very little MP back for you, but it's going to be very efficient at killing enemies, whereas something that takes more shots is not going to kill enemies as fast, but it's going to give you more MP, so you'll be able to heal and stuff a lot more as a result. This is one of the extra little bits of depth of the arsenal to make sure you're using the right weapon for the right situation based on whether or not you're trying to harvest some extra MP for a desperate heal or something. You also have trinkets, which are one of the main things that you find in those difficult platforming challenges and other optional areas in the game, and these are basically like Hollow Knight's pins. They are a limited equipment accessory system where they each take up a certain number of points, and you have a certain number of points worth that you can equip at any given time, and you just have to, find the build that you want to use right now that you have the capacity for. You can also find capacity extending items in hidden places around the world too, so that you can equip more trinkets. But the trinkets themselves are actually pretty cool because they tend to do all sorts of weird stuff. Some of them are even weapon specific, like completely altering the behavior of certain weapons if you're using them. And there are also some trinkets for the more usual stuff, like the magnet one that makes money gravitate towards you after you kill an enemy, which is always useful for the early game. But you've also got some other stuff, like the one that makes your bullets do damage over time, or the one that gives you a big range and damage boost as long as you're at full health. There's even one that destroys enemy bullets in a circle around you whenever you take damage. So there's quite a bit of variety when it comes to the trinkets, and there's a bunch of them to find, and this is kind of what I meant when I said the game is good at rewarding you for exploration, because this is one of the big things that it'll actually give you. You'll often come across some more difficult challenges, some optional stuff out in the world, and optional platforming challenges will very usually lead to new trinkets and other shiny bits to have, whereas optional bosses and things tend to lead to new weapons. You do get some more magic-y stuff a little bit later, but I don't actually want to spoil that, so I'm not showing any of that in the background. I'm actually showing a lot of the earlier game stuff right now because there's some really cool stuff later on, but I kind of don't want to spoil that sort of thing because this is actually a pretty narratively focused Metroidvania. It has a story for you to follow. It lets you loose in a pretty big world, but there's still a linear narrative that you're meant to be a part of. And there are several characters and other NPCs that you meet along the way, as well as, of course, the bosses themselves, which often have things to say to you. Some of them even hang around after the boss fight, and you can talk to them after you beat them and some stuff like that. The story is definitely an unusual one because the idea is you are a changeling, you are a member of the Fae, and you are trying to bring the Age of Man to an end because it's lasted for too long. And as you can probably see in the footage, the Age of Man isn't doing so hot right now because everything is rusted over and ancient and old and broken down. So there's some shenanigans going on, and you're trying to figure out exactly what's happening as well as complete your mission without being labeled a traitor by everyone. So it's an odd story for sure, and it's a story that I think is really cool because, just like the rest of the game, it is very unusual for a Metroidvania. It is doing things quite differently than the usual save the world kind of setup. Also of note, by the way, is the music. The music in this game is really, really good. There's a reason that the soundtrack is available because it's kind of got this like dreamy, atmospheric vibe a lot of the times during more of the exploring sections, and then the boss battle music is fantastic. It's a lot more, of course, upbeat and actiony and stuff, and overall it makes the soundtrack to this game very ethereal, very dreamlike. And honestly, the music pretty much perfectly matches that sort of bleak beauty that the game has visually. So its visuals and its audio are very much in harmony with each other when it comes to creating this sort of somber, almost post-apocalyptic-y sort of fairy vibe sort of thing going on. It's actually a really cool aesthetic that the game is going for, honestly, and I think it pulls it off very well when you combine its art style with its music. The one criticism I have is also not exactly a traditional criticism. It's something that is only going to bother some people, but I feel like I should mention it either way. This is one of those games that's relatively easy to get lost in because it doesn't give you a lot of direction. This is often the case with a lot of Metroidvanias that will give you a very wide open world to explore, and you just kind of have to remember like where the blue door was so that when you get the blue thing to unlock the blue door, you can go back to it. That's just a common part of Metroidvanias, but in this case, because there's a lot less marking like that. You know, there are no blue doors exactly, there are green doors, but the idea being that you have this grappling hook so you can go a lot of places at once and only later find out that they're gated off by something else for now. It means that it's kind of easy to explore a whole bunch of directions partially before you find the one right direction, and then you forget exactly which ones of those partial directions are the ways you need to go now. So this is definitely the kind of game where you are expected to do a lot of exploration on your own and just sort of find your way around by your feelers and just sort of figure out what to do by purely exploring. The game very rarely points you to a specific place. It does a couple of times actually give you on your map an actual marker that says, hey, go here, dummy, but most of the time it doesn't do that. So you are just sort of to the wind, and you just kind of figure it out yourself. And that is simultaneously a really cool thing because it gives the game a very good feeling of exploration and wanderlust. But at the same time, I can see how maybe some people that are not like me, that are less about the exploration and stuff, might get frustrated with how open the overall structure is because it's not always clear exactly where you should be. There is one weird thing I feel like I should mention though. Some of the boss fights in this game are a little weird with one aspect. They're really hard. I find this game quite difficult. I should probably point out the boss fights in this game are very challenging a lot of the times. But there is one thing they do that bothers me that I feel like I should mention. Sometimes, well actually every time when a boss changes phases, bosses usually have 2 or 3 phases with a full health bar each. When they change phases, they jet across the screen at like a really high velocity that you could never ever get out of the way of in time because you don't have a dash or anything like that. There's no immunity frames under normal circumstances, and they just sort of reset at a certain point to sort of begin their new phase. But this resetting process, for some reason, they still have collision when they do this, so they can actually damage you. This means that if you're standing on certain parts of the battlefield while a boss phase changes to its next phase, you will take guaranteed damage no matter what, because they move so fast, like in a couple of frames. Actually, I've timed it out with recordings. A lot of bosses do this in like 4 or 5 frames. They can cross the entire screen, because they're just resetting their positioning for the next phase, but the fact that they still have collision while they're doing this is kind of weird, and it means that some bosses can just obliterate you really fast because they sort of spawn right where you are all of a sudden and just kill you instantly, and you had no way of knowing that was going to happen. At least not the first time, so this means that every attempt after that you're going to make it a point to stand at certain parts of the battlefield right as the phase changes to make sure you're not in the way of this extra fast movement. It's a weird little problem, but it is something that I feel like I should mention because it does get kind of frustrating sometimes because contact with bosses does a lot of damage. So having them do this like unavoidable scramble across the screen to start their next phase is a bit odd. But yeah, overall, Rusted Moss is an excellent Metroidvania. It has a wonderful art style, some really fun combat, and is doing a lot of things very differently, things that help to make it stand out, things that make it worth a look if you're a Metroidvania fan. And that's exactly what I would say, actually. I recommend this game if you're a Metroidvania fan of any kind. It does everything it sets out to do very well and is quite good at providing a bit of a different experience than you may have played before. So that is my current take on Rusted Moss. Quite excellent, definitely recommend it. I will link you, as always, in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can go and check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.